The abandoned warehouse on Industrial Boulevard reeked of chemicals and death. Jake "Razor" Morrison had seen plenty of both in his 15 years with the Hells Angels, but nothing prepared him for what he found chained behind the makeshift meth lab. A German shepherd, barely alive, cowered in the corner, ribs showing, eyes pleading. For 2 decades, Jake had been the club's most feared enforcer, the man who collected debts, settled scores, and never asked questions. His knuckles were scarred from countless fights, his reputation built on brutality. He'd earned his patch through the ranks of one of the most dangerous motorcycle clubs in the country. But something about this dog's broken spirit mirrored his own. As sirens wailed in the distance and rival gang members closed in, Jake faced an impossible choice: save the dog and risk everything he'd built, or walk away and remain the monster he'd become. The shepherd's weak whimper cut through his armor like nothing ever had. In that moment, Jake realized he was just as chained as the animal before him. But could a hardened criminal really change his spots, or was redemption just another fantasy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's massive frame filled the doorway as he stared at the scene before him. The meth lab was crude but functional. Glass tubing snaked across makeshift tables, chemical residue coating every surface. But it was the corner that held his attention. The dog lay on its side, a heavy chain wrapped around its neck and bolted to a concrete pillar. Patches of fur were missing, revealing infected wounds that spoke of systematic abuse. This wasn't supposed to happen. The job was simple: torch the rival serpent's operation and send a message. Get in, set the charges, get out. Clean and efficient, the way Jake had handled dozens of similar jobs. But Viper's intel hadn't mentioned any animals. The sirens grew louder. Jake's Harley waited outside, engine still warm. He could be gone in 30 seconds, racing through the maze of industrial streets he knew better than his own heartbeat. The dog would be another casualty in an endless war between clubs, another piece of collateral damage he'd learned to ignore. The dog's eyes tracked his movement. Brown eyes, intelligent despite the pain. Jake had seen that look before, in mirrors during his worst moments, in the faces of his victims, in his own reflection when he thought nobody was watching. It was the look of something dying from the inside out. His phone buzzed. Text from Viper, 5 minutes out. Better be done. Jake cursed under his breath. The serpents would return soon, and when they did, they'd be armed and angry. He'd already planted the charges, enough C4 to level half the warehouse. The timer showed 3 minutes and counting. The smart play was to leave. Jake Morrison always made the smart play. That's how he'd survived 15 years in a world where most didn't make it past 5. That's how he'd built a reputation that made grown men cross the street when they saw his colors. But Razor Morrison, the enforcer, the feared lieutenant of the Hells Angels Oakland chapter, found himself kneeling beside a dying dog in a meth lab that was about to explode. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice rougher than he intended. The dog flinched at his approach, trying to shrink further into the corner. Jake had that effect on everything living. Fear was his currency, intimidation his trade. The chain was thick, military grade. Jake tested the bolt, securing it to the pillar. Solid. He'd need tools he didn't have, time he couldn't spare. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through countless gang wars and police raids, screamed at him to walk away. Instead, he pulled out his knife. The dog's breathing was shallow, labored. Jake could see every rib, count each vertebra along its spine. This wasn't just neglect. This was deliberate cruelty. Someone had enjoyed watching this animal suffer. Jake knew about suffering. He'd caused enough of it. The faces of his victims haunted his rare, quiet moments. Shopkeepers who couldn't pay protection money, rival gang members who'd crossed invisible lines, anyone who'd gotten in the way of club business. He'd told himself it was necessary, part of the life he'd chosen. But looking at this broken animal, he wondered when necessity had become an excuse for becoming something monstrous. The timer on his phone showed 90 seconds. Jake positioned his knife against the chain link closest to the dog's neck. The metal was thick, but his blade was sharp. He began to saw, each stroke sending vibrations through the chain. The dog whimpered, thinking this was another form of torture. "I'm trying to help," Jake muttered, knowing how ridiculous the words sounded coming from him. When was the last time Jake Morrison had helped anything? 60 seconds. The dog didn't move when Jake approached the next morning, just watched him with those dark eyes that held too much knowledge for any living thing. Jake had spent the night in his trailer, staring at the water-stained ceiling and thinking about chains and choices. He'd told himself he was done with the German Shepherd, that walking away was the smart play, but smart had never been his strong suit. He'd brought a thermos of black coffee and a gas station breakfast burrito that tasted like cardboard and regret. The meth lab sat silent in the early light, its windows reflecting the grey sky like dead eyes. Tommy's crew wouldn't be back until evening. They were creatures of habit, predictable as clockwork. That gave Jake maybe 10 hours to figure out what the hell he was doing. The dog's water bowl was bone dry. Jake filled it from a gallon jug he'd grabbed from his truck, setting it just within the animal's reach. The German Shepherd sniffed the air but didn't drink, watching Jake with the wariness of something that had learned trust was a luxury it couldn't afford. "Smart," Jake muttered, settling onto an overturned crate about 6 feet away. "Don't trust the guy in leather. Good policy." He unwrapped the burrito and took a bite, grimacing at the artificial cheese that coated his tongue like plastic. The dog's nose twitched at the smell, and Jake caught the subtle shift in its posture, not quite hope, but interest. When had it last eaten? Jake tore off a piece of the burrito, picking out the chunks of questionable meat, and tossed it toward the dog. It landed just short of the water bowl. The animal looked at the food, then at Jake, then back at the food. The internal debate played out across its scarred features. Hunger won. The dog stretched forward, chain rattling, and wolfed down the morsel in 2 quick bites. Jake threw another piece, this one a little closer to himself. The pattern repeated, "Look, consider, devour." "Yeah, I know the feeling," Jake said, thinking about his own desperate hungers, the things that had driven him to this life of fists and fury. Sometimes you take what you can get, even when you know it might bite you in the arse. By the time the burrito was gone, the dog had inched forward enough to drink from the water bowl. Jake watched the pink tongue lap at the liquid, noting how the animal kept one eye on him, even while drinking. Professional paranoia, another thing they had in common. Jake's phone buzzed. Text from Diesel, "Church tonight. 8 p.m. Don't be late." Church. That's what the Hells Angels called their mandatory meetings, where brotherhood was enforced with the threat of violence, and loyalty was measured in blood and silence. Jake had missed the last one, claiming he was running down a lead on some stolen bikes. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was getting tired. Tired of the fights, the fear in people's eyes, the way his own reflection looked more like his father's every day. He typed back, "I'll be there." The dog had finished drinking and was now lying down, though its head remained raised, alert. The chain around its neck was thick enough to anchor a boat, attached to a steel post driven deep into the concrete. Overkill for restraining an injured animal, unless the animal wasn't the real prisoner. Jake studied the setup with the eye of someone who'd spent 20 years breaking things and people. The post was solid, but the concrete around its base showed hairline cracks. The chain was strong, but chains had weak links. Everything could be broken if you knew where to apply pressure. "What's your story?" he asked the dog. "You born into this mess, or did you choose it?" The German Shepherd's ears twitched at his voice, but it offered no answers. Jake wasn't sure he wanted them anyway. Stories had a way of complicating things, and his life was complicated enough. Jake stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. The dog watched him prepare to leave, and something in its expression made him pause. Not hope exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding. It had been abandoned before. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake heard himself say, the words surprising him with their conviction. "Not yet." He walked back to his truck, mind already working through possibilities and problems. There were tools in his garage, bolt cutters that could handle most chains. But cutting the dog free was only the beginning. After that came the hard part, figuring out what to do with a damaged animal in a world that didn't much care about damaged things. The German Shepherd watched him drive away, still and patient as a monument to all the broken promises the world had to offer. The first thing Jake noticed when he woke up wasn't the pounding in his skull or the taste of stale whiskey coating his tongue. It was the silence. No growling Harley engines outside his trailer, no voices shouting orders or threats, just quiet, broken only by the soft sound of breathing that wasn't his own. He cracked open one eye, then both, his vision adjusting to the dim light filtering through grimy windows. The German Shepherd lay on a pile of old blankets in the corner, watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog's ribs were still visible beneath patchy fur, but the worst of the wounds had been cleaned and bandaged with torn strips from Jake's least dirty t-shirt. "You're still here," Jake muttered, sitting up slowly. His back protested from sleeping on the couch instead of giving the dog his bed. "Figured you'd bolt first chance you got." The dog's ears perked up at his voice but otherwise didn't move. Smart animal. Trust would take time if it came at all. Jake's phone buzzed on the coffee table, displaying 3 missed calls from Bones and a text that made his stomach clench. "Church tonight. 8 p.m. Don't be late." Church meant club business, real business, the kind that usually ended with someone bleeding or worse. Jake had missed 2 days of check-ins while dealing with the dog, and in the Hells Angels, absence without explanation was never overlooked. He glanced at the shepherd again. The animal needed more medical attention than Jake's amateur first aid could provide, but vets asked questions. They reported animal abuse. They remembered faces. All things that could complicate Jake's already precarious situation. The trailer door rattled under heavy knocks before Jake could decide his next move. "Open up, Razor." "Bones." Jake recognized the gravelly voice of his sergeant-at-arms immediately. The dog's ears flattened against its skull, a low whine escaping its throat. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, though he doubted the animal understood. He threw a blanket over the dog's makeshift bed and moved to the door. Bones stood on the rickety steps, his massive frame blocking most of the doorway. Behind him, 2 other club members flanked the entrance like leather-clad gargoyles. Tommy Ink Rodriguez and Pete Wrench Williams, both men Jake had ridden with for years, both capable of extreme violence when the situation called for it. "Where the hell have you been?" Bones pushed past Jake into the trailer without invitation. "Diesel's been looking for you. Says you disappeared right after the lab raid. Been sick." Jake lied smoothly. "Food poisoning or something. Been puking my guts out for 2 days. Ink snorted. "You look like shit, I'll give you that." The blanket in the corner shifted slightly, and Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. If they found the dog, questions would follow. Questions about where it came from, why he had it, what happened at the lab, questions he couldn't answer without revealing more than he was prepared to share. "What's Diesel want?" Jake asked, trying to draw their attention away from the corner. "Business," Bones said simply, "the kind that requires your particular skills. We got a problem with the Iron Wolves. They've been moving product in our territory, and diplomacy ain't working." Jake knew what that meant. The Iron Wolves were a smaller MC that had been testing boundaries for months. Diplomatic failure meant violence was the next step. Specifically, it meant Jake would be expected to send a message that couldn't be misunderstood. "When?" he asked. "Tonight after church. We ride out to their clubhouse, have a conversation." Bones smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "Bring your tools." The blanket moved again, more noticeably this time. Wrench's eyes narrowed as he looked toward the corner. "What you got over there, Razor?" "Laundry," Jake said quickly. "Haven't had time to deal with it." Wrench took a step closer, curiosity overriding politeness. The dog chose that moment to let out a soft whimper, barely audible but distinct enough that all 3 men heard it. "That laundry just wine?" Ink asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife on his belt. Jake's mind raced through options, none of them good. He could try to lie again, but these men weren't stupid. He could fight. But 3 against 1 in a confined space meant certain defeat. Or he could tell some version of the truth and hope their loyalty to him outweighed their loyalty to club rules. "It's a dog," he said finally. "Found it half dead behind some tweaker's place. Couldn't just leave it." Bones raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you give a shit about strays?" "Since never," Jake admitted. "But this one, I don't know, seemed worth saving." The 3 men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Bones shrugged. "Your business, brother. Just don't let it interfere with club business. Church is at 8. Don't make us come looking for you again." They filed out as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving Jake alone with the dog and the weight of what tonight would bring. The dog hadn't moved from the corner of Jake's garage in 3 days. It lay on the pile of old blankets he'd thrown down, those amber eyes tracking his every movement but never approaching. Jake had tried everything, talking softly, leaving food closer each day, even sitting on the concrete floor reading his bike manual aloud. Nothing worked. "You're as stubborn as I am," he muttered, setting down a bowl of water just outside the dog's reach. The German shepherd's ears twitched, but that was all. His phone buzzed. Tank's name lit up the screen, and Jake's stomach tightened. He'd been dodging calls from the club for 2 days, claiming he was sick. In the Angels, that excuse only bought you so much time. "Yeah. Church tonight, 8 sharp. Prospects got intel on those Mongols moving product through our territory." Tank's voice carried that edge it got before violence. "You better be there, brother. Viper's been asking questions." The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone, then at the dog who was watching him with what looked like understanding. Those eyes had seen plenty of violence too. By 7:30, Jake was suited up in his leather vest, the death's head patch heavy on his back. He'd left extra food and water for the dog, though it still hadn't eaten much. The vet he'd called, anonymously, said it could take weeks for a traumatized animal to trust again. Weeks Jake wasn't sure he had. The clubhouse sat squat and defiant on the edge of town, surrounded by bikes that gleamed under the parking lot lights. Jake's Harley rumbled as he pulled up, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar ritual. But something felt different tonight. Off. Inside, cigarette smoke hung thick as fog. The brothers sat around the battered wooden table that had seen more blood than most emergency rooms. Viper occupied the president's chair, his grey hair pulled back in a ponytail that did nothing to soften his reptilian stare. "Well, well, Razor decided to join us." Viper's smile held no warmth. "Heard you've been under the weather." "Food poisoning," Jake replied, taking his usual seat. Around the table, familiar faces watched him, some curious, others suspicious. Tank nodded from across the room, but even he looked wary. "Funny thing about being sick," Viper continued, lighting a fresh cigarette. "Makes a man think. Sometimes thinking too much ain't healthy for an angel." The prospect, a skinny kid named Diesel who'd been hanging around for months, cleared his throat nervously. "Should I, give my report now?" Viper waved him forward. Diesel stammered through intelligence about Mongol movements, drug shipments, and vulnerable territory. Standard stuff that would normally have Jake calculating angles of attack and body counts. Instead, he found himself thinking about amber eyes and the way the dog flinched whenever he moved too fast. "So we hit them tomorrow night," Viper concluded after Diesel finished. 3-man team, quick and dirty. His gaze fixed on Jake. "Razor, your point man. Time to remind folks why they call you that." The nickname came from his preferred weapon, a straight razor that had opened more throats than he cared to count. The brothers respected the blade's intimacy, the way it required getting close enough to smell your victim's fear. Jake had always taken pride in that reputation. Now it sat in his stomach like spoiled meat. "What's the play?" he heard himself ask, though part of him was already calculating excuses to get out of it. Tank leaned forward. "Mongols are using that warehouse on 5th Street. Word is they've got a shipment coming in around midnight. We go in hard, take out whoever's there, and torch the place. Casualties?" The question slipped out before Jake could stop it. The room went quiet. 20 pairs of eyes stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "Since when do you care about casualties?" Viper's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the room. "You going soft on us, Razor?" Jake felt the weight of their stares, the sudden shift in temperature. In the Angels, showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters, but something in him had changed these past few days, something he couldn't name and didn't fully understand. "Just want to know what we're walking into," he said carefully. "Professional curiosity." Viper studied him for a long moment, then laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Professional curiosity. I like that." He stood, grinding his cigarette under his boot. Church dismissed. "Razor, stick around." The others filed out, leaving Jake alone with the president. Viper circled the table slowly, predator assessing prey. 20 years you've been my enforcer," he said finally. 20 years of perfect loyalty. So I'm going to ask you once, and I want the truth." He stopped directly behind Jake's chair. "You having second thoughts about the life?" Jake felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. One wrong word, and he'd be decorating the clubhouse walls. But somewhere in his mind, amber eyes watched him with something that might have been hope. "No second thoughts," he lied smoothly. "Just want tomorrow to go clean." Viper's hand landed heavy on his shoulder, half blessing, half threat. "Good. Because the Angels are forever, brother, and forever's a long time to live with regret." The vet clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake sat in the cramped waiting room, his leather jacket creaking against the plastic chair. The German shepherd lay on a blanket beside him, breathing steadily but still unconscious from the sedatives. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked on the dog for 3 hours, setting bones, stitching wounds, and administering 4 fluids. "He's going to make it," she'd said, pulling off her surgical gloves. "But it'll be a long recovery." Jake's phone buzzed against his chest. Tommy's name flashed on the screen for the 4th time in 2 hours. He let it go to voicemail again. The Angels would be wondering where he was, why he'd disappeared after the lab raid. Spider Murphy ran a tight operation. Accountability was everything. The dog's ear twitched, and Jake found himself leaning forward. One dark eye cracked open, immediately alert despite the medication. The animal's head lifted slightly, scanning the unfamiliar environment before settling on Jake's face. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending his hand slowly. "You're safe now." The dog's nose worked, taking in Jake's scent. After a moment of consideration, a tentative tail wag began. Something loosened in Jake's chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. Dr. Chen emerged from the back room, clipboard in hand. She was younger than Jake expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. "He's responding well to the antibiotics. The fractures are clean breaks. They'll heal properly with time and rest." "How long?" Jake asked. 6 to 8 weeks minimum. He'll need daily medication, wound care, and absolutely no strenuous activity." She studied Jake's tattooed hands, the club colors on his jacket. "Do you have somewhere suitable for recovery?" Jake's apartment was a studio above a tattoo parlor, barely big enough for his motorcycle gear and a mattress. The clubhouse was out of the question. Spider had a strict no-pets policy, and the constant noise and chaos would terrify a traumatized animal. "I'll figure something out," he said. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "There's a rescue organization that specializes in abuse cases. They have foster families experienced with—" The word came out sharper than Jake intended. The dog's eye fixed on him again, and he forced his voice lower. "I mean, I'll handle it. He stays with me." The vet nodded slowly. "He'll need a name for the medical records." Jake looked down at the dog, noting the intelligent dark eyes, the noble bearing that persisted despite everything the animal had endured. A warrior, like himself, but one who'd chosen trust over vengeance. "Ranger," he said. "His name is Ranger." Outside the clinic, Jake's phone rang again. This time, it was Spider himself. Jake couldn't ignore that call. "Where the hell are you, Morrison?" Spider's voice carried the edge that made grown men nervous. "We had business to finish at that lab." "Had to take care of something," Jake said, watching Dr. Chen's assistant carry Ranger to a recovery kennel. "I'll be there in an hour. You better have a damn good explanation. Tommy said you went soft over some mutt." The accusation hit harder than it should have. Going soft was a death sentence in the angels' world. It meant you couldn't be trusted, couldn't be counted on when things got brutal. Jake had built his reputation on being the opposite of soft. He was the blade Spider drew when problems needed cutting. "Tommy talks too much," Jake said. "I'll handle Tommy. See that you do. Church tonight at 9. Don't be late." The line went dead. Jake stared at his phone, weighing his options. He could walk back into that world, pretend the last 6 hours hadn't happened, return to being Razor Morrison, the Angels' most feared enforcer. It would be easier. It would be safer. Through the clinic window, he watched Ranger lift his head as Dr. Chen checked his bandages. The dog's tail wagged weakly when she spoke to him, already learning to trust again despite everything humans had done to him. Jake made his decision. At a hardware store across town, he bought dog food, bowls, a proper bed, and enough medical supplies to stock a field hospital. The clerk, a kid with nervous eyes, kept glancing at Jake's colors but didn't ask questions. Smart kid. The clubhouse would have to wait. Spider's anger would burn hot but brief. Jake had earned enough respect over the years to weather one missed meeting. But missing church was different. Church was sacred, mandatory, the heart of the Angels' brotherhood. Jake loaded his purchases into his truck and headed back to the clinic. He had maybe 4 hours before he'd have to choose between his old life and something he couldn't quite name yet. 4 hours to figure out how a man built for violence could become something else entirely. Ranger was waiting for him, those dark eyes holding a trust Jake wasn't sure he deserved, but was determined to earn. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake paced the small waiting room, his boots clicking against the linoleum with each turn. The receptionist, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair, kept stealing glances at him from behind the counter. He could practically feel her nervousness radiating across the room. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the back room, pulling off latex gloves with a practiced snap. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Jake caught the tightness around her eyes. "How is he?" Jake asked, stepping forward. "Alive," she said simply. "That's something. But Jake, I have to ask, where did you find this dog?" "Somewhere he shouldn't have been," Jake said finally. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. "The injuries are consistent with prolonged abuse. Malnutrition, dehydration, multiple contusions. Someone used this animal as a punching bag for months, maybe longer." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "Will he make it?" "I think so. He's a fighter. German shepherds usually are. But it's going to be a long road. He'll need surgery on his left rear leg. The brake wasn't set properly when it happened, so the bone healed wrong. And there's the psychological trauma to consider." "Psychological trauma?" Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Dogs remember, Jake, especially the smart ones like shepherds. He's going to be afraid for a long time. Might never fully trust humans again." Jake stared at the door leading to the back rooms, imagining the dog lying on some metal table, fighting for his life. Something twisted in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that made him uncomfortable. "I want to see him." "That's not—" "Please." Dr. Chen studied his face for a long moment, then sighed. 5 minutes. And don't touch anything." She led him through a maze of examination rooms to a recovery area in the back. The German shepherd lay on his side in a large kennel, and 4-line running into his foreleg. His breathing was shallow but steady. Up close, under the harsh veterinary lighting, the extent of his injuries was even more apparent. Patches of fur were missing, revealing mottled bruising underneath. His ribs showed clearly through his coat. "Jesus," Jake whispered. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and one brown eye cracked open. For a moment they stared at each other through the kennel bars. The dog's gaze was wary but not terrified, not like it had been behind the meth lab, He recognizes you, Dr. Chen said, surprise evident in her voice. Jake knelt down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Hey there, boy. You're safe now. The dog's tail moved once, barely a flutter against the blanket beneath him. That's the first positive response we've gotten from him, Dr. Chen murmured. He growled at everyone else who came near. Jake felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates moving deep underground. This broken animal trusted him. Him, a man whose hands had inflicted their own share of damage over the years. The irony wasn't lost on him. What happens now? He asked, standing. Surgery tomorrow morning if he's strong enough, then recovery, rehabilitation, finding him a home with someone who understands traumatized animals. She paused. Jake, caring for a dog like this is expensive and time-consuming. Are you sure you want to take this on? The question surprised him. Was he taking this on? When had that decision been made? But looking at the dog, this fighter who'd somehow survived hell and still had enough trust left to wag his tail, Jake realized the choice had been made the moment he'd cut those chains. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. Dr. Chen nodded. All right then. I'll need a name for the paperwork. Jake looked back at the German shepherd, thinking about the scars they both carried, the battles they'd both survived. Tank, he said. His name is Tank. As they walked back to the front of the clinic, Dr. Chen stopped at her office door. Jake, there's something else. Dogs like Tank, they need consistency, routine, a calm environment. She met his eyes directly. Whatever life you're living now, it might not be compatible with caring for him. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of what she was really saying. Taking care of Tank would mean changes, big ones, the kind that might put him at odds with everything he'd built his life around. I'll figure it out, he said. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jake climbed onto his Harley but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he sat there, thinking about trust and second chances, about the choices that defined a man's life. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake paced the narrow waiting room, his boots clicking against the linoleum with each turn. The antiseptic smell reminded him of the emergency room where he'd waited after Tommy got shot 3 years back. Same helpless feeling, same churning in his gut. He's stable, she said quickly, reading his face, but it was close. Severe dehydration, multiple fractures in his ribs and... She paused, her jaw tightening. Evidence of repeated beatings. This wasn't random cruelty, Mr. Morrison. This was systematic torture. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Will he make it? The next 24 hours are critical. I've got him on 4 fluids and pain medication. The ribs will heal, but the psychological trauma... She shook her head. That dog has been living in hell. It's going to take time, whatever it costs. That's not the issue. Dr. Chen crossed her arms, studying him with dark, intelligent eyes. I've seen you around town. I know who you are, what you represent. So I have to ask, why this dog? Why now? The question hit Jake like a sucker punch. He'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd cut those chains. The smart answer was to walk away, let the professionals handle it, get back to his life. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those amber eyes looking up at him with something that might have been hope. Can I see him? Dr. Chen hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Don't expect much response. Jake approached slowly, his usual swagger replaced by something gentler. Hey there, boy. The dog's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't open his eyes. I know you got no reason to trust anybody right now, Jake said quietly, his voice rough. Hell, I wouldn't either, if I was you. But you're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you again. A soft whimper escaped the dog's throat, so quiet Jake almost missed it. The admission surprised him. He never talked about his old man, about the belt and the bottles and the fear that had shaped his childhood. But something about this broken animal made the walls he'd built seem pointless. Difference is, I got big enough to hit back. You never had that choice. This time, when Jake's fingers touched the space between the dog's ears, the animal didn't flinch. The trust in that simple moment hit Jake harder than any punch he'd ever taken. His phone buzzed. Tommy's name flashed on the screen. "Where the hell are you?" Tommy's voice was tight with irritation. "Spike's asking questions. You were supposed to check in hours ago." Jake glanced at the sleeping dog, then stepped into the hallway. "Had something to take care of." "What kind of something? Because word is, you tore through Diego's operation like a man possessed, and now nobody can find you." "It's handled." "Handled how?" "Jake, talk to me. Spike's got that look, you know the one. He's wondering if you're going soft." The accusation stung because it carried truth. But looking back through the door at the broken animal he'd saved, Jake couldn't bring himself to care about Spike's opinion. "Tell Spike I'll report when I'm ready." "Jesus Christ, Jake. Whatever's going on with you—" Jake ended the call and turned off his phone. He knew he was buying temporary peace at best. Spike Martinez didn't tolerate defiance, and going dark after an unauthorized raid would have consequences. The smart play was to head back to the clubhouse, spin some story about teaching Diego a lesson, and pretend the dog had never happened. Instead, he walked back into the recovery room. "You got a name?" he asked the sleeping animal. "Can't keep calling you boy forever." The dog's tail moved slightly, just the tip, like he was trying to wag but didn't have the strength. "How about Rex?" Jake tried. No response. "King? Ranger?" When he said Duke, the dog's eyes opened for the first time, amber gold and surprisingly alert despite the pain medication. "Duke it is." Jake settled into the chair beside the table. "Get some sleep, Duke. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain. Inside, a broken man and a broken dog began the slow work of healing. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Rex's bandaged form as Jake sat vigil in the uncomfortable plastic chair. 3 days had passed since the surgery, and the dog's breathing had finally steadied into something resembling normal sleep, rather than the labored gasps that had kept Jake awake those first nights. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the back office, her scrubs wrinkled from another 18-hour shift. She'd been pulling double since Rex arrived, claiming it was standard protocol, but Jake suspected she was as invested in the dog's recovery as he was. "His white blood cell count is improving," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "The infection from those wounds was worse than I initially thought, but he's responding well to the antibiotics." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd discovered muscles in his jaw he never knew existed from clenching his teeth every time he thought about what Rex had endured. The dog's ribs were still visible beneath the patchy fur, but color had returned to his gums, and yesterday Jake had caught him trying to wag his tail when Sarah approached with food. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her tone shifting. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being able to keep him. It's not that I don't want to." The words came out rougher than Jake intended. "My life isn't exactly stable. A dog deserves better than what I can offer." Sarah studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see past the leather vest and tattoos to something underneath. "You know, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen a lot of owners come through here. Some treat their animals like expensive accessories, others like living lawn ornaments. But I've watched you these past 3 days, Jake. You've barely left his side. So? So maybe you're selling yourself short." She leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "Rex is going to need ongoing care, physical therapy for his leg, medication for at least another month, and honestly, a lot of patience. He's been traumatized. It'll take time for him to trust again." Jake's phone buzzed against his chest pocket. Viper's name flashed on the screen for the 3rd time that day. He'd been ignoring calls from the club, knowing they'd want answers about his absence, about the meth lab, about why he'd gone radio silent. The irony wasn't lost on him that sitting in this sterile clinic, watching over a broken dog, felt more real than anything he'd done in years of riding with the angels. "I should take this," he muttered, but made no move toward the phone. "Should you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake thought about Tommy Rodriguez, probably scrambling to explain the missing product to suppliers who didn't accept excuses. He thought about Viper, whose patience had limits even for his best enforcer. He thought about the clubhouse, thick with smoke, and the kind of casual violence that had shaped his adult life. Then Rex stirred on the examination table, lifting his head just enough to fix those dark eyes on Jake. The dog's tail moved once, a barely perceptible flutter, but it might as well have been a flag planted on conquered territory. "The thing about second chances," Sarah said quietly, "is that sometimes they come disguised as responsibility. Sometimes the thing that saves us is the thing that needs saving." Jake's phone stopped buzzing. In the silence that followed, he could hear Rex's steady breathing, the hum of the clinic's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic carrying people to lives that suddenly seemed foreign to him. What would it take? The question escaped before he could stop it, hypothetically. Sarah's smile was small but genuine. A stable living situation, someone who can be home regularly, at least for the first few months. And honestly, someone who understands that healing isn't linear. Some days will be better than others. Jake thought about his apartment above the auto shop, sparse but clean. He thought about the money he'd been saving without any real purpose, bills paid and little else to spend it on besides beer and gas for his Harley. He thought about mornings that might involve something other than nursing hangovers and planning collections. "The club won't understand," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. "Will you?" Rex made a soft sound. Not quite a whine, but something more tentative. Jake stood and moved to the table, letting the dog sniff his hand before gently stroking the space between his ears where the fur was growing back. "What do you think, boy?" Jake whispered. "You willing to take a chance on a broken-down biker?" Rex's response was to rest his muzzle against Jake's palm, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Morrison felt something that might have been hope. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake sat in the cramped waiting room, his leather jacket draped over the plastic chair beside him. The receptionist, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair, kept glancing nervously in his direction. He couldn't blame her. Even without his colors, he looked like trouble. Through the examination room door, he could hear Dr. Sarah Chen speaking in soothing tones to Rex. The dog had barely eaten since Jake brought him home 3 days ago, and the trembling hadn't stopped. Jake's attempts to coax him with strips of bacon had failed miserably. "Mr. Morrison?" Dr. Chen emerged, her expression carefully neutral. "Could I speak with you?" Jake followed her into the sterile room where Rex lay on the examination table, his golden eyes tracking every movement. The dog's ribs were still visible beneath his coat, and the scars around his neck told their own brutal story. "He's severely traumatized," Dr. Chen said, pulling off her latex gloves. "Beyond the malnutrition and physical abuse, this dog has been systematically brutalized. He's going to need extensive rehabilitation, possibly months of it." "What kind of rehabilitation?" "Behavioral therapy, essentially. Teaching him to trust again. It's expensive, and there's no guarantee he'll ever fully recover." She paused, studying Jake's face. "I have to ask where you found him." Jake met her gaze steadily. Behind a meth house that got raided. Dog was chained up, half dead. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "That explains the chemical burns on his paws. The police will want to know about this. They already know about the house. But not about him, I'm guessing." Her voice held no judgment, just professional curiosity. "Mr. Morrison, I've been a vet for 12 years. I've seen what happens to animals caught up in that world. Most don't survive. The fact that you got him out—" She gestured toward Rex, who had lifted his head at the sound of Jake's voice. "He's responding to you. That's significant." Jake approached the table slowly, extending his hand, palm up. Rex's nose twitched, and after a long moment, he allowed Jake's fingers to brush against his snout. "What do I need to do?" Jake asked. Dr. Chen outlined a treatment plan that included specialized food, medication for anxiety, and weekly sessions with an animal behaviorist. The cost made Jake wince internally, but he nodded along. His savings from years of club work would take a serious hit, but money felt less important than it used to. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said, as Jake carefully lifted Rex from the table. "He needs stability. Loud noises, sudden movements, aggressive behavior around him. It'll all set back his progress. A dog like this needs a calm, predictable environment." Jake almost laughed at the irony. His life was anything but calm or predictable. Between club business and the constant underlying tension that came with his reputation, his world was built on the possibility of violence. How could he provide what Rex needed when his own existence was fundamentally chaotic? As they left the clinic, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy: "Church tonight. Mandatory. Big developments." Jake stared at the message while Rex sat patiently beside his bike. Church meetings were sacred in the club. Missing one without being in the hospital or dead was unforgivable. But looking down at the dog, Jake felt something shift inside his chest. He thought about Dr. Chen's words. Rex needed stability, needed someone who could provide a foundation of trust. For the first time in years, Jake found himself questioning whether he could be that person while still being Razor. The ride home was slow and careful, with Rex secured in a makeshift carrier attached to the bike. Jake had never ridden so cautiously, hyper-aware of every pothole and turn. When they reached his apartment, he helped Rex inside and watched as the dog immediately retreated to the corner behind the couch, his safe space. Jake's phone rang. Spider's name flashed on the screen. "You coming tonight or what?" Spider's voice carried an edge. "Tommy's been asking." Jake looked at Rex, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. The dog had learned to read human moods as a survival mechanism, and Jake could see him tensing as the conversation continued. "Yeah, I'll be there," Jake said finally. After hanging up, he sat on the floor across from Rex's corner, keeping his distance but maintaining eye contact. The dog's breathing was rapid, stressed from the vet visit and the uncertainty of his new environment. "I know this is all messed up," Jake said quietly. "You deserve better than this, better than me." Rex's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and gradually the rapid breathing slowed. They sat like that for nearly an hour, two damaged souls trying to figure out how to coexist. As evening approached, Jake realized he was going to have to make a choice. He could keep trying to balance his old life with this new responsibility, or he could admit that some things were incompatible. The question was whether he had the courage to choose. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, sliding off the bike. The dog had grown stronger over the past week, his ribs less prominent, but he still favored his left hind leg. Jake had taken to wrapping it each morning, Max sitting patiently while rough hands worked with surprising gentleness. The back door opened before Jake could knock. Tommy Spider Kowalski emerged, his skeletal frame wrapped in a torn flannel shirt. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cigarette. "Christ, Razor, you actually came." Spider's voice carried the rasp of too many chemicals and too little sleep. "Thought maybe you'd gone soft, disappearing like that." Jake studied his old contact. Spider had always been twitchy, but this was different. The man looked like he was dissolving from the inside out. "You said you had information about the Brennan operation." Yeah, I do." Spider's gaze darted to Max, who had positioned himself between Jake and the doorway. "What's with the mutt?" "He's with me. Talk." Spider laughed, a harsh sound that turned into a coughing fit. "Look at you, Razor Morrison, with a pet. The boys wouldn't believe it." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Come on inside. Wall's got ears out here." The interior of the safe house reeked of stale smoke and unwashed bodies. Empty pizza boxes and beer cans littered a card table where Spider had been playing solitaire with half a deck. Max's nose wrinkled, and he pressed closer to Jake's leg. "Brennan's moving his operation," Spider said without preamble. "Word is he's got heat coming down, thanks to someone torching his last place." His eyes glittered with something between fear and malice. "Funny thing, though, witnesses say it was a lone biker with a dog." Jake kept his expression neutral. "That so?" "Oh, it gets better." Spider pulled out a crumpled photograph from his shirt pocket. Brennan's offering 50 grand for information leading to this mystery rider. Dead or alive, he ain't particular. The photograph was grainy, clearly taken from a security camera, but Jake recognized himself and Max fleeing the burning lab. His stomach tightened, not for himself, but for the dog who'd gotten dragged into this mess. Here's the thing, Razor. Spider's voice dropped to a whisper. I know it's you. Saw you that night, followed you from Murphy's bar. Question is, what's that information worth to you? Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the knife on his belt, but Max stepped forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's hackles rose as he stared at Spider, and something in his stance made Jake pause. Max had never shown aggression toward people before, only protective instincts. Smart dog, Spider said, but his smile looked forced. Knows a dangerous man when he sees one. What do you want, Spider? Passage out of town. New identity. Brennan's cleaning house, and guys like me, we know too much to stay healthy. Spider's hands shook worse now. I give you everything I know about his new setup, you get me gone. Fair trade. Jake considered this. Spider was small-time, a bottom feeder who sold information to whoever paid best. But he was also exactly the kind of loose end Brennan would eliminate without hesitation. What's the new location? Spider wagged a finger. Insurance first. I want your word, Razor. The old code. You get me out, I sing like a canary. The old code. Jake remembered when those words meant something, when honor among thieves wasn't just a saying. But looking at Spider's deteriorating form, seeing the desperation in his eyes, Jake wondered if either of them had any honor left worth invoking. Max whined softly, pressing against Jake's leg. The dog's warmth anchored him, reminded him why he was here. Not for revenge, not for the club, but because sometimes the right thing was also the hardest thing. All right, Jake said finally. But I want everything. Locations, security, timeline. You hold back even one detail, our deal's off. Spider's relief was visible. You got it. But Razor, we gotta move fast. Brennan's paranoid as hell right now, and if he finds out I'm talking... He didn't finish the sentence. Jake nodded, already mentally calculating routes and resources. Getting Spider out of town would be dangerous, but the information might be worth the risk. More importantly, it might give him the chance to shut down Brennan's operation for good. Max looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and Jake could swear the dog understood exactly what they were walking into. The police station buzzed with late-night activity as Jake sat in the hard plastic chair, his hands still stained with blood that wasn't his own. Detective Sarah Chen had been questioning him for 2 hours, her voice steady but her eyes revealing exhaustion that matched his own. Walk me through it again, she said, setting down a fresh cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. You went to the warehouse because... I told you, I had business with Kozlov. Jake's voice was hoarse from talking. When I got there, his boys were already dead, blood everywhere. Chen leaned back in her chair, studying him. And you expect me to believe that Viktor Kozlov, a man with more enemies than a politician, just happened to get executed right before you showed up for a friendly chat? Jake almost smiled at that. Friendly chat. If only she knew what he'd really planned for Kozlov. Sometimes timing's just shit, detective. Your club's been at war with the Russians for months, bodies dropping on both sides. Now their main supplier is dead along with his crew, and you're sitting here without a scratch. Maybe I'm lucky, or maybe you're lying. The door opened, and another detective entered, whispering something in Chen's ear. Her eyebrows raised slightly before she nodded, and the other officer left. Interesting development, she said, settling back into her seat. Ballistics came back on the shell casings, military-grade ammunition. Not the kind of thing your average biker gang typically uses. Jake kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Military-grade. That narrowed things down considerably. The Angels had connections, but most of their firepower came from street sources. This was something else entirely. You thinking this was a professional hit? He asked. I'm thinking you might know more than you're telling me. Chen opened a manila folder and spread out crime scene photos. 7 men dead, execution style, clean, efficient. Either you've upgraded your skills dramatically or someone else wanted Kozlov gone as much as you did. Jake studied the photos, seeing details he'd missed in the chaos of the moment. The positioning of the bodies, the precision of the wounds. Whoever had done this wasn't just professional, they were military trained. There's something else, Chen continued. We found surveillance footage from a traffic camera 3 blocks away, black SUV leaving the area around the time of the shooting. No plates visible, but the vehicle matches one reported stolen from a rental company downtown yesterday. Sounds like you got your lead then. Maybe. But here's what bothers me, Morrison. Your bike was parked 2 blocks from the warehouse when we found it. You telling me you walked past a black SUV speeding away from a crime scene and didn't think to mention it? Jake's jaw tightened. The truth was, he'd been so focused on getting away from the warehouse, so shaken by what he'd seen, that he hadn't paid attention to anything else. But admitting that meant admitting he'd fled a crime scene, which wouldn't help his case. I was in shock, he said finally. 7 dead bodies will do that to a man. Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stood up. I'll be right back. Alone in the interrogation room, Jake closed his eyes and tried to piece together what had happened. Someone had wanted Kozlov dead badly enough to hire professional killers, someone with resources and connections. But who? The Angels had enemies, but most of them settled disputes with fists and crude weapons. This was something else entirely. Corporate, calculated. His thoughts were interrupted when Chen returned, her expression unreadable. Your lawyer's here, she said. Jake frowned. I didn't call a lawyer. Well, someone did. Marcus Webb from Webb, Sterling and Associates. High-end firm. The kind that charges more per hour than most people make in a month. Before Jake could respond, the door opened and a man in an expensive suit entered. Mid-50s, silver hair, and the kind of confidence that came from never losing. Mr. Morrison, the lawyer said, extending his hand. Marcus Webb, I'm here to represent you. Your club retained our services, Webb interrupted smoothly. President Hendricks felt you might need legal counsel given the circumstances. Jake shook the offered hand, but his mind was spinning. Tommy had sent a high-priced lawyer? That didn't make sense. The club's usual attorney was a public defender who specialized in bar fights and drug possession charges. My client won't be answering any more questions, Webb announced to Chen. Unless you're charging him with something, we'll be leaving. Chen looked frustrated but nodded. You're free to go, Morrison, but don't leave town. We'll have more questions. As they walked out of the station, Jake felt the weight of too many unanswered questions. Professional killers, military ammunition, expensive lawyers appearing out of nowhere. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple war between bikers and Russians. The courthouse steps felt like walking into enemy territory. Jake adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, the fabric foreign against his neck after years of leather and denim. Beside him, Max walked with careful precision, the dog's training evident in every measured step. The German shepherd had come so far from the broken animal Jake had found behind that meth lab 6 months ago. You sure about this? Tommy asked, falling into step beside them. The younger angel had insisted on coming, despite Jake's protests. No, Jake said honestly, but we're doing it anyway. Inside, the federal courthouse buzzed with activity. DEA agents moved through the halls like sharks in expensive suits, their eyes tracking Jake's every movement. He recognized some faces from his file, Agent Sarah Chen, who'd been building cases against the Angels for 3 years, and her partner Rodriguez, whose mustache had gone gray chasing bikers across state lines. The witness room was sterile white, all harsh fluorescence and government-issue furniture. Jake sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Harrison, a man whose reputation for dismantling criminal organizations preceded him like a warning shot. Before we begin, Harrison said, sliding a thick folder across the table, I want you to understand what you're walking into. Your testimony will effectively end the Hells Angels drug operations in 3 states. These people won't forgive that. Jake's hand found Max's head, fingers working through the dog's thick fur. The simple contact steadied him. They stopped being my people the moment I saw what they did to him. The first session lasted 4 hours. Harrison walked Jake through the hierarchy, the money flows, the violence that kept everything running smoothly. Jake found himself describing things he'd tried to forget, beatings that went too far, rivals who simply disappeared, the casual brutality that had become as routine as morning coffee. "Tell me about Vincent Caruso," Harrison said, consulting his notes. Jake's jaw tightened. Caruso ran the meth distribution, a thin man with dead eyes who treated violence like an art form. Vinny's the one who chained Max behind the lab. Dog was supposed to be protection, but Vinny used him as a punching bag when deals went south. "You witnessed this abuse?" "More than witnessed it." Jake's voice carried gravel. "First time I saw him kick Max, I told him to back off. He laughed, said the dog was worthless anyway. Probably would have killed him eventually." Harrison made careful notes. "What changed your mind about cooperating?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, remembering that night behind the lab. The dog's broken whimper, the chain cutting into infected wounds, the moment when everything he'd accepted about his life suddenly felt wrong. "I spent 15 years believing strength meant taking what you wanted, hurting anyone who got in your way. Then I saw this dog, half dead and still trying to protect territory that wasn't even his. Made me realize I'd been confusing strength with cruelty." The sessions continued for days. Jake detailed operations spanning years, identified players in a network that stretched from Mexican suppliers to street-level dealers. Each revelation felt like shedding skin, painful but necessary. On the 3rd day, Chen approached him during a break. "You know there's no going back from this. I figured that out a while ago. The Angels have people everywhere, prison, witness protection, even some law enforcement. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." Max pressed against Jake's leg, sensing the tension. "Maybe, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." Chen studied him with calculating eyes. "What about the dog? What about him? When this goes to trial, when you're relocated, what happens to him?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on doing the right thing that he hadn't considered the practical consequences. Witness protection meant new identity, new location, new life. But Max wasn't just a pet anymore. He was evidence, a symbol of the case, and potentially a target. "I don't know," Jake admitted. That evening, Jake sat in his motel room with Max sprawled across his feet. The dog had filled out over the months, his coat now thick and glossy, but the scars remained. Jake could relate to that. Some damage never fully healed just became part of who you were. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Nice dog." Would hate to see something happen to him. Jake deleted the message and double-checked the locks. Outside, a motorcycle rumbled past slowly, the sound making Max's ears prick up. They were being watched, had been since the day Jake first walked into the FBI field office. He thought about Chen's question. In trying to save Max, had he ultimately put the dog in more danger? The life of a federal witness wasn't exactly stable, and the Angels had long memories. But looking at Max, seeing the trust in those dark eyes, Jake knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. They'd figure out the rest together, one day at a time. The safe house felt like a tomb. Jake sat on the edge of the sagging couch, his hands shaking as he tried to roll a cigarette. Diesel lay beside him, the dog's breathing shallow but steady, his ribs wrapped in clean white bandages that were already showing spots of red seepage. The veterinarian Rodriguez had called in favors to bring here, had done what he could, but the words echoed in Jake's mind. "The next 24 hours will tell us everything." Rodriguez paced by the window, occasionally peering through the gap in the curtains at the empty street below. "Your friend Danny's been asking questions. Word is he's got backing from some of the other chapters now." Jake's fingers stilled on the tobacco. What kind of backing? The kind that comes with muscle and money. Seems like your little rescue mission has stirred up more than just local trouble. Rodriguez turned from the window, his face grim. There's talk of a vote, official club business. The cigarette fell apart in Jake's hands, tobacco scattering across his jeans. A vote meant the entire chapter would decide his fate. In 30 years with the Angels, he'd seen only 3 such votes. None of those men had walked away. How long do I have? Meetings set for tomorrow night. Warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. Rodriguez sat down across from him, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Jake, you need to understand what you're up against here. It's not just about the dog anymore. You killed 3 members of a charter. You destroyed a significant revenue stream. And now you're making them all look weak by hiding out instead of facing judgment. Jake's hand found Diesel's head, stroking the soft fur between his ears. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and something tight in Jake's chest loosened just slightly. I won't abandon him. Then you're signing your death warrant. Maybe. Jake met his friend's eyes. But for the first time in my life, I'm doing something that doesn't make me feel like a monster when I look in the mirror. The words hung between them like smoke. Outside, a car backfired, and both men tensed until the sound faded into the distance. Jake knew. The club was a spider's web, and every strand was connected to every other. Pull too hard in the wrong direction, and the whole thing collapsed on top of you. But sitting here, watching Diesel fight for every breath, he couldn't bring himself to care about the consequences anymore. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Heard you found yourself a pet. Shame if something happened to it. Jake showed Rodriguez the screen. His friend's jaw tightened. He's watching us. Let him watch. Jake deleted the message and set the phone aside. I'm done running. You can't take on the whole club, Jake. Not even you. Maybe not. But I can make sure they remember why they used to call me Razor. Rodriguez stood up, his hand moving instinctively to the gun under his jacket. You're talking about war. I'm talking about doing the right thing for once in my goddamn life. Jake's voice was steady now, the shaking in his hands gone. This dog trusted me to save him. I won't let him down. The room fell silent except for Diesel's labored breathing and the distant hum of traffic. Jake felt something shift inside him, like tumblers falling into place in a lock he'd been trying to open his entire life. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in his gut, but it was overwhelmed now by something else, something he hadn't felt since he was 17 years old and thought he could change the world. Purpose. Rodriguez moved back to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. Vehicle coming up the street, black SUV, tinted windows. Jake was already moving, scooping Diesel up as gently as he could manage. The dog whimpered once, but didn't struggle. Back exit, through the kitchen. My bike's in the alley. They moved quickly through the small house, Jake cradling Diesel against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of the dog's heartbeat against his ribs. Behind them, car doors slammed in the street. At the back door, Rodriguez grabbed Jake's arm. Whatever happens tomorrow night, you don't have to face it alone. Jake met his eyes and nodded. Then they were outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap as they ran for the motorcycle. Diesel's weight felt precious in his arms, fragile and vital and worth everything Jake had left to give. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned warehouse district as Jake sat in his truck, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Beside him, Rex's ears twitched at every distant sound, the dog's instincts still sharp despite the comfortable routine they'd fallen into over the past weeks. Today felt different, though, charged with the kind of tension that made Jake's old scars ache. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. Tommy's name flashed on the screen. What news? Rodriguez got himself arrested last night. Big bust at his new operation. Feds found enough product to put him away for 20 years. Jake felt his stomach drop. Miguel Rodriguez had been the link between the Hells Angels and the meth trade that Jake had been slowly dismantling from the inside. If Rodriguez was talking to save his own skin, Any word on what he's saying? Nothing official yet, but word is he's singing like a canary. Names, dates, locations, the whole 9 yards. Tommy paused. Your name came up, brother. Rex whined softly, sensing Jake's sudden tension. Jake's hand found the dog's head automatically, drawing comfort from the warm fur beneath his fingers. How much trouble am I in? Hard to say. Could be nothing, could be everything. But Viper called a meeting for tonight. Mandatory attendance. Tommy's voice carried a warning that needed no elaboration. After hanging up, Jake sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Rex nudged his arm, dark eyes full of understanding that seemed almost human. Over the past month, the dog had become more than a companion. He'd become Jake's anchor to something decent in a world that had shown him precious little decency. What do you think, boy? Time to disappear? Rex tilted his head, and Jake could swear he saw disapproval in those intelligent eyes. Running had been his first instinct, the same survival mechanism that had kept him alive through 15 years of violence and betrayal. But looking at Rex, remembering the broken dog he'd found chained behind that meth lab, Jake realized that running would make him no different than the cowards who'd abandoned Rex to die. The drive back to his apartment gave him time to think. The smart play was to pack light and hit the road before sunset. He had enough money stashed away to start over somewhere new, somewhere the Hells Angels' reach wouldn't extend. Canada, maybe, or Mexico. Rex would adapt. The dog had already shown remarkable resilience. But as they climbed the stairs to his apartment, Jake found himself thinking about the other dogs at Sarah's shelter, the ones still waiting for someone to care enough to fight for them. He thought about Tommy's kids, who'd started asking when Uncle Jake would visit again. He thought about the handful of decent people he'd encountered in his journey away from violence, people who'd shown him that there was still good worth protecting in the world. Inside the apartment, Jake pulled out a duffel bag and started packing, his movements mechanical and practiced. Rex watched from the doorway, head tilted in that questioning way that had become familiar. When Jake reached for the photo of his mother, the only family photo he'd kept, he stopped. His mother had run from his father's violence, taking Jake with her when he was 8 years old. They'd lived in shelters and cheap motels for 2 years before his father found them. Jake could still remember the sound of his mother's voice when she'd told him to hide in the bathroom while she faced his father alone. He'd been too young to help her then, too small to make a difference. But he wasn't 8 years old anymore. Jake set down the photo and looked at Rex, who had moved closer, brown eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that took his breath away. In those eyes, Jake saw something he'd spent his entire adult life running from, the expectation that he could be better than his worst impulses, that he could choose to stand and fight for something worthwhile instead of running toward the next violent solution. "You're right," he said quietly, dropping the duffel bag. "Running away won't fix anything." Rex's tail wagged once, a brief acknowledgement that somehow felt like approval. Jake walked to his closet and pulled out a different kind of preparation, a small digital recorder he'd bought weeks ago but never used. If tonight was going to be his last meeting with the Hells Angels, he'd make sure it counted for something. The FBI would be very interested in what Viper had to say about Rodriguez's arrest, especially if Jake could deliver it along with his own testimony about the club's operations. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it was also the first truly brave thing he'd considered doing in years. Rex settled at his feet as Jake began planning what might be either his redemption or his funeral. The courthouse steps felt like walking to the gallows. Jake adjusted his tie, a foreign noose around his neck, and caught his reflection in the glass doors. Clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing Marcus's borrowed suit, he looked like a stranger. Rex padded beside him, the dog's presence the only thing keeping his legs moving forward. "You don't have to do this," Sarah whispered, her hand finding his elbow. "We can still walk away." Jake shook his head. "Yeah, I do." His voice carried the weight of every choice that had led him here. "It's time." Inside, the federal courthouse buzzed with controlled chaos. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, their briefcases clicking against marble floors. Jake spotted Detective Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, near the information desk. The cop who'd been hunting him for 3 years now waited to escort him to the biggest gamble of his life. Morrison. The detective's nod held grudging respect. "Ready for this?" "As I'll ever be." They rode the elevator in silence, Rex's tags jingling softly. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing closer to Jake's leg. On the 7th floor, they walked past conference rooms where futures were decided in whispered conversations and signed documents. The room they entered was smaller than Jake had expected. Federal prosecutor Janet Chen sat at one end of a polished table, her reputation for taking down organized crime preceding her like a shadow. Across from her, Jake's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Rodriguez, shuffled through papers with the resignation of someone who'd seen too many lost causes. "Mr. Morrison," Chen's voice was crisp, professional. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about what you're offering and what the government is prepared to give in return. The information you've provided so far has been substantial." Chen opened a thick file. The weapons trafficking ring, the money laundering operation through the motorcycle dealerships, the drug distribution network. "But we need testimony. Open court." "You understand what that means?" The weight of it settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. Testifying meant painting a target on his back that would never fade. It meant his old life didn't just end. It exploded in spectacular fashion, taking others down with it. "I understand." Rodriguez leaned forward. "Jake, once you sign this agreement, there's no going back. You'll be testifying against men who consider killing a business expense." Through the window, Jake could see the city spreading out below. Somewhere in those streets, Tommy and the others were going about their business, unaware that their enforcer had become their executioner. The thought should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding his breath for years. "Tell me about the Riverside operation," Chen said, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed the meth lab where he'd found Rex, now a scorched ruin. "Our sources indicate this was more than just a manufacturing facility." Jake's hand found Rex's head, drawing strength from the contact. "Distribution hub for the entire Western Territory. Tommy Vega ran it personally, used it to cut deals with the Mexican cartels. The lab was just cover." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "There's a storage facility 3 miles north, warehouse space rented under a shell company. That's where they keep the real product before it hits the streets." Chen made notes, her pen scratching across legal pads. For the next hour, Jake methodically dismantled the criminal empire he'd helped build. Names poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Financial details, operational procedures, planned jobs, everything he'd carried in silence for years spilled across the conference table. Rex slept at his feet, occasionally twitching in dreams that Jake hoped were better than either of their realities had been. "One more thing," Chen said as the session wound down. "Marcus Williams, the veterinarian who's been helping you. Our investigation shows he's clean, but his association with you puts him at risk. He saved my dog's life. Saved mine too, in a way." Jake's jaw tightened. "You keep him out of this. Whatever protection you can give him, he gets it. That can be arranged." Chen closed her files. "Court begins Monday morning. Are you prepared to face them?" Jake looked down at Rex, remembering the broken animal he'd found chained behind that lab. Now the dog slept peacefully, trusting completely in the man who'd become his unlikely savior. Sometimes redemption was that simple, and that hard. "Yeah," Jake said, standing up. "I'm ready." As they left the courthouse, Sarah fell into step beside him. "How do you feel?" Jake considered the question, watching Rex investigate a fire hydrant with scientific thoroughness. "Like I finally stopped running from something and started running toward it instead." The afternoon sun felt different on his face, warmer somehow, despite the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The courtroom felt smaller than Jake had imagined. its beige walls closing in as he sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his court-appointed lawyer. 3 months had passed since the raid, 3 months of county jail and legal maneuvering that had led to this moment. His hands, scarred from years of violence and now softened slightly from inactivity, rested flat on the polished wood surface. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Catherine Reeves said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the gallery. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Before I pronounce sentence, I want to be clear about what we're dealing with here." Jake's lawyer, a thin man named Garrett who smelled perpetually of coffee and stress, had prepared him for this moment. The plea deal was solid, testimony against the Serpents and information about their drug operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. But judges had discretion, and Judge Reeves had a reputation for unpredictability. "You've lived a life of violence, Mr. Morrison. Your record speaks to decades of choices that have caused immeasurable harm to your community." She flipped through the file before her, each page turn echoing in the quiet room. Assault, drug trafficking, weapons charges, intimidation of witnesses. The list goes on. Jake forced himself to breathe steadily. In his cell at night, he'd often thought about Rex, wondering if the dog remembered him, if Maria was keeping her promise to send updates. The last letter had included a photo of Rex playing in her backyard, his coat glossy and full, his eyes bright with something Jake had never seen in them before: joy. "However," Judge Reeves continued, "this court also recognizes that people can change. Your cooperation with law enforcement has been described by the prosecution as unprecedented and invaluable. The dismantling of the Serpent's drug operation has potentially saved countless lives." The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Davidson, had explained it to him weeks ago. His information had led to the arrest of 17 people, the seizure of over $2 million in drugs and cash, and the shutdown of 5 different operations. The meth lab where he'd found Rex was just the beginning. His knowledge of the Serpent's network had unraveled everything. "Stand up, Mr. Morrison." Jake rose, his legs steadier than he'd expected. Garrett stood beside him, and Jake could smell the man's nervous sweat mixing with his cologne. "For the charges of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, assault with a deadly weapon, and racketeering, this court sentences you to 8 years in state prison with credit for time served. However, given your cooperation and the court's assessment of your potential for rehabilitation, I'm suspending all but 18 months of that sentence." Jake felt the words hit him like a physical blow. 18 months total. He'd already served 3. 15 months left. The math seemed impossible, too good to be true. "You will serve the remainder of your sentence at the minimum security facility in Millfield, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will complete anger management counseling, substance abuse treatment, and 100 hours of community service annually during your probation period." Judge Reeves set down her papers and looked directly at him. "Mr. Morrison, I've seen a lot of men like you in my courtroom. Most of them come back. They serve their time, get released, and within 2 years they're sitting in that chair again, older but no wiser." Jake met her gaze, thinking of Rex's trusting eyes, of Maria's quiet strength, of the choice he'd made in that moment behind the meth lab that had changed everything. "But something tells me you might be different. The fact that you risked everything to save an abused animal suggests there's something decent buried under all that violence. Don't waste this opportunity." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo in Jake's chest. Around him, the courtroom erupted in the shuffling of papers and quiet conversations, but Jake remained standing, absorbing what had just happened. 15 more months. Then what? The Hells Angels would never take him back. Informants didn't get second chances in that world. The Serpents, what was left of them, would want him dead. He'd burned every bridge that had connected him to his old life, but maybe that was the point. Maybe sometimes you had to burn everything down to build something new. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Jake thought about Rex waiting in Maria's backyard, about second chances, and the strange ways grace sometimes arrived in the darkest moments. He was ready to finish this part of his story. The courthouse steps felt like walking through enemy territory, but Jake kept his shoulders squared as he climbed toward the entrance. 3 months had passed since the night everything changed, and today would determine whether his decision to cooperate with the feds had been worth it. Razor padded beside him, the German shepherd's presence drawing curious stares from reporters and courthouse regulars. "You sure about bringing him in?" Detective Martinez asked, catching up to them at the security checkpoint. "He's a registered therapy animal now," Jake replied, showing the paperwork. "Besides, he's seen worse than whatever's waiting in there." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same dog he'd saved from a chain now wore a service vest, officially trained to provide emotional support. The transformation had taken months of work with a professional trainer, but Razor had taken to it naturally, as if he understood his new purpose. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen approached their table, her expression professional but warm. Over the past months, she'd become more than just a prosecutor to Jake. She'd been patient through his struggles with going legitimate, understanding that 20 years of learned behaviors didn't disappear overnight. "The defense is going to try to discredit your testimony by focusing on your past," she said quietly. "Stay calm, stick to what you witnessed at the lab, and remember why you're doing this." Jake's fingers found Razor's head, the familiar comfort grounding him as the courtroom filled. Tommy Snake Valdez, the meth cook who'd been using the dog as a punching bag, sat at the defendant's table looking every bit the predator Jake knew him to be. Their eyes met briefly, and Snake's smirk was all the reminder Jake needed of why he was here. When his name was called, Jake stood and walked to the witness stand with Razor at his side. The oath felt heavier than expected, each word carrying the weight of the bridge he was burning. "State your name and occupation for the record," Chen began. "Jake Morrison. I'm currently enrolled in a welding certification program and work part-time at Mountain View Animal Sanctuary." The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Williams, wasted no time during cross-examination. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you've been known by the nickname Razor and have been a member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for over 15 years? "Yes. And during that time, you've been arrested how many times for violent crimes?" Jake met the man's stare. 7 times. Convicted twice. "So you're asking this jury to believe that a career criminal suddenly developed a conscience?" Before Jake could answer, Razor shifted slightly, pressing against his leg. The simple contact reminded him of countless nights when the dog's presence had kept the nightmares at bay, of the slow process of learning to channel his protective instincts in a different direction. "I'm asking them to believe that sometimes you see something that makes you realize you've been on the wrong side," Jake said. "That dog was chained in the dark, beaten regularly, used as entertainment by men who thought suffering was funny. If standing up to that makes me a snitch, I'll wear that label." Williams pressed on, but Jake felt himself settling into a calm he'd never experienced in conflict before. Every question about his past was answered honestly. Every attempt to minimize what he'd witnessed at the meth lab was met with clear, unflinching detail. When it was over, Jake returned to his seat feeling drained but strangely peaceful. The trial continued around him, but his part was done. He'd told the truth. Consequences be damned. During the lunch recess, he and Razor walked to a small park near the courthouse. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter. As they sat on a bench, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his sponsor. "Heard you testified today. Proud of you. Coffee tomorrow at 7? 6 months clean, and the meetings still felt awkward, but they were helping. The anger that had fueled so much of his life was slowly being replaced by something he was still learning to recognize. Purpose that didn't require violence. "Mr. Morrison?" He turned to find an elderly woman approaching hesitantly. "I was in the courtroom today. I just wanted to say thank you. My grandson was one of the kids buying from that lab. What you did today, speaking up, it matters." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Jake staring after her. Razor nudged his hand, and Jake realized his eyes were wet. As they headed back toward the courthouse for the afternoon session, Jake caught sight of the iron wolves in the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of his resolve. But today, he'd chosen truth over loyalty to a code built on silence. And somehow, that felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. "Almost there, Atlas," Jake said, the name he'd chosen feeling right on his tongue. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, tail wagging against the padded interior of the sidecar. The youth center sat on the outskirts of Sacramento, a sprawling complex of low buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing that reminded Jake uncomfortably of other places he'd known. But this fence was different. It was meant to keep the world out, not the residents in. Sarah met them in the parking lot, her face lighting up as Atlas bounded from the sidecar to greet her. "He looks incredible," she said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "How's the training going?" "Better than mine," Jake admitted, pulling off his helmet. The leather vest he wore now bore no patches, no symbols of allegiance to anything but himself. "Doc says he's ready. Question is whether I am." They walked toward the main building, Atlas heeling perfectly beside Jake's left leg. The therapy dog certification had taken months of work, countless hours of training sessions and patience Jake never knew he possessed. But watching Atlas transform from a broken, terrified animal into this confident, gentle companion had taught Jake something about his own capacity for change. "The kids we're working with today have been through trauma," Sarah explained as they approached the entrance. "Some from the streets, others from homes that weren't much better. They don't trust easily." Jake nodded, understanding flooding through him. "Neither did he," he said, gesturing to Atlas. "Neither did I." The group session took place in a circle of mismatched chairs in a room painted cheerful yellow. 12 teenagers, their faces bearing the premature hardness Jake recognized from his own mirror years ago, sat with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity as Sarah introduced them. "This is Jake and Atlas," she said simply. "They're here to share their story." For a moment, Jake felt the familiar surge of anger at being scrutinized, judged. Then Atlas leaned against his leg, a warm, solid presence that anchored him to the present moment. He took a breath and began to speak. He told them about finding Atlas behind the meth lab, about the choice between walking away and getting involved. He talked about the raid, the arrests, the trial where his testimony had helped put Marcus Reeves and his crew away for decades. He didn't sugarcoat his own past, the violence, the brotherhood built on fear and intimidation, the years of choosing the easy path that led nowhere good. "I thought strength meant never backing down, never showing weakness," he said, his hand resting on Atlas's head. "Took a beaten dog to teach me that real strength is choosing to be better than what the world expects from you." As the session continued, Jake watched the walls come down incrementally. The kids asked questions about Atlas's training, about motorcycle maintenance, about the difference between belonging to something destructive and building something worthwhile. One boy, barely 16 with gang tattoos already marking his neck, spent the last 20 minutes of the session sitting on the floor with Atlas's head in his lap, tears streaming silently down his face. Afterward, as they walked back to the parking lot, Sarah squeezed Jake's shoulder. "That was powerful," she said. "Would you consider making this a regular thing?" Jake looked down at Atlas, who gazed back with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to trust again anyway. "Yeah," he said, "I think we'd like that." As they rode home, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with proving his toughness or maintaining his reputation. He thought about the boy with the tattoos, about the choice that kid would make tomorrow and the day after that. Sometimes redemption came on 4 legs, but more often it came one day at a time, one choice at a time, one chance to be better than the sum of your mistakes. Atlas barked once, happy and free, and Jake smiled as he opened up the throttle and carried them both toward whatever came next.